certainly the increasing episode of a heat wave is going to pose challenges to the data center industry, especially if they're still using conventional air cooling systems.
Hello everyone, welcome to Green IO with Gaël Duez. That's me. Green IO is a podcast for responsible technologists building a greener digital world, one bite at a time. Twice a month, on a Tuesday, our guests from across the globe share insights, tools, and alternative approaches, enabling people within the tech sector and beyond to boost digital sustainability. Because accessible and transparent information is in the DNA of Green IO, all the references mentioned in this episode, as well as the transcript, will be in the show notes, both on your podcast platform and on our website, greenio.tech. When it comes to sustainability, I have a sweet spot for Singapore because of its uniqueness. This is one of the top cities in the entire world which has benefited the most from the global extractivist, highly carbonized and financialized economy, and also one of its most at risk of climate change. Hence, a blossoming of initiatives there on how to both pivot towards more sustainability and mitigate climate change impacts. And these efforts apply especially to the backbone of IT infrastructure, data centers. As we are growing aware of, the human body has some physiological limits that can be reached during heat waves, where the wrong mix of high temperature and humidity is reached. It's death for people staying outside too long, and this concerns everyone, not only the populations usually at risk like infants or elderly people. It was really well illustrated by Jean-Marc Jancovici and Christophe Blain in their international bestseller comics World Without End. And based on a 2020 mega study published in Environmental Sciences, a third of humankind is now at risk to live in places where temperature could be lethal several weeks per year. Well, everything that I just said about humans apply to data center equipment, which also needs to be cooled down 24/7. For many obvious reasons, starting with latency and sovereignty, we cannot move all data center in the world where the air will remain cool, like the Nordics. Hence, a serious challenge for the tech industry: how to run sustainable data center, and more specifically, how to build sustainable data center hubs where tropical climate creates hurdles which are getting bigger due to climate change. To discuss this, I'm honored to have Professor P.S. Lee on the show. Based in Singapore, PS is National University of Singapore Dean's Chair of Mechanical Engineering and one of the most cited scientists in mechanical engineering and transport energy engineering worldwide. He has specialized in data center engineering for 2 decades, and he's also a field practitioner, the founder of Coolers DC, what a cool name, which advises top DC operators like Equinix or Meta. He will also be our keynote speaker at the Green IO Singapore conference in 2 weeks, April 18th to be precise. One reason among many reasons to join the first conference in Asia, focusing 100% on green IT. And Green IO listeners can get free tickets using the voucher Green IO VIP. And how exciting it is to kickstart my discussion with Professor Lee. Welcome, Foseng. Thanks a lot for joining Green IO today.
Hey, hi, Gil. Thanks for having me. So it's my pleasure to be on your podcast.
So, P.S. I played again with the excellent Climate Central's coastal risk screening tool, which enables people to simulate the impact of the sea level rise, among other impacts. And the results were already concerning for a 44 centimeter water level rise, which is the current IPCC best estimator for the business as usual scenario, with most of the iconic gardens by the bay in Singapore under the water. And if we simulate a 2 meters rise, a likely scenario if some tipping points with ices in Greenland or Antarctica are reached, well, the entire Singapore's harbor is at risk. My point is, climate change is very real for Singaporean. Could you maybe explain us why and what is more precisely at stake here?
Sure. I would like to refer to the recently published 2023 Singapore Climate Report, which marks an alarming continuation of global warming trends, with Singapore experiencing its fourth warmest year. Since unprecedented temperatures, especially during the months of May and October, this underline the urgency of addressing climate change. And the report's projection of up to 326 high heat stress days by 2099 in high emission scenarios starkly highlights the impending challenges, right? Especially for industries like the IT sector.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but Singapore is a very massive IT hub in Southeast Asia. Is that correct?
Yes, as of the 2 to 3 years ago, Singapore, the data center, the capacity is actually close to 1 gigawatt, and that is actually close to the 10% of the whole of APAC. So for city states to be hosting that kind of capacity is actually quite amazing. But it's actually important to manage the power and the associated carbon footprint, right? So as it is right now, the data center industry is already consuming 7% of Singapore total electricity consumption. And if we don't manage this, right, in a couple of years, this can actually go up to 12%, right? So that's why the Singapore the government has actually imposed a data center moratorium about 2.5 to 3 years ago, which they finally lifted the year before. Right thereafter, there was a data center call for application, which the industry expected to meet very stringent criteria, including PUE no more than 1.3, as well as the adoption of innovative and sustainable data center solutions.
You mean that for 2 years and a half, it was not permitted to build a new data center facilities in Singapore?
That's right.
And just to make sure I understood well, so it's already 7% of electricity consumption, and it could triple with the current trend.
Yes, and especially with the interest in AI, in other high power workloads, right? So if we don't manage this in a sustainable fashion, so this percentage is certainly going to increase very sharply over the next couple of years.
So clearly, the Singaporean government doesn't want to go the Irish way with the Irish scenario, where I reckon today the electricity consumed by the data center industry is already above 20, if not 25%. I don't recall the number exactly, but it was really mind blowing. And so you were mentioning this very strict criteria to build now data center in Singapore. Obviously, low carbon electricity and also innovative solution. Maybe it would be interesting to unpack the challenges that data center operators in Singapore and more largely in tropical climates are facing.
Yeah, sure. I think the first and the foremost, operating data centers here in the tropics, right, with a high ambient temperature and humidity is actually going to be a very energy sapping exercise because of the constant cooling needs, right, in order to maintain the IT equipment within acceptable temperature range, right, in order to ensure proper and reliable operations. But associated with the heat stress that we're experiencing, right, during the recent few years due to climate change, this has actually imposed a more challenging condition, right, for data center operators to ensure the resilient as well as efficient operation of a data center here in the tropics, and specifically here in Singapore. So that's definitely going to be the going. They are constantly looking for more energy efficient cooling solution, and this goes beyond operational efficiency. Right, it's about rethinking energy sourcing as well, right, and potentially integrating renewable energy sources to mitigate the carbon footprint. And for a city state like Singapore, the in terms of domestic generation of renewable energy is going to be limited as well. Right? I think the only viable renewable energy source here is actually solar, right? And based on a report published by the Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore series, which is hosted here at NUS. So even if we were to use up all our rooftop space for the solar panels, right? So the percentage of the electricity supply that comes from solar is actually still going to be very limited, right? Well less than 10%. So that's why I think Singapore is actually adopting innovative approach, right? Whereby we're actually cutting the agreements with our ASEAN neighbors to look into the imports of green electrons, low carbon electricity. Then I think related to the temperature, the challenge or the temperature or what we call the thermal management challenge, right, associated with operating a data center here. There's also this wear and tear on IT equipment, right? Because the increased heat stress days will directly translate to accelerated depreciation of critical data center equipment. And this necessitates more effective maintenance and proactive design consideration that can withstand the rigor of a harsher climate. And again, related to a climate, right? So when it comes to heat rejection, typically we need to operate the cooling towers that actually consumes water. Then that brings about the water sustainability issues, right? So given the intensity or the intensification of the extreme weather events, right? So water cooling the technologies, right, while efficient, it may actually impose a sustainability challenge. Hence, we are always actually looking at better ways of reusing water, recycling, right, along with explorations of air and more efficient liquid cooling alternative. And these are now becoming imperative. But we are also grappling with, for example, the challenge of skilled workforce, right? Especially if you look across the region, Southeast Asia, right? So the data centers industry is actually booming. So how do we actually adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change of data center? Also means nurturing a workforce which is proficient in IT, in engineering, and understanding sustainability practices and technology. So there are definitely quite a few challenges that we are confronting today.
If I follow you here in trying to wrap up what you say, I've listed 4 challenges. You've got the energy challenge, the equipment challenge, the water challenge, and I would say the workforce challenge.
Yes, yes, these are the exact four points that I mentioned.
And I think it will worth deep diving on all of them. So if we start with the energy challenge, I've got a first question. So you mentioned solar and solar not being able to attend more than to contribute to more than 10% of the overall electricity production. But what about wind energy? Is there any ability to put a wind farm around Singapore, or is it just something completely nuts because of all the boats traffic?
Yeah. So the Singapore is what we call a renewable energy challenge country, right? So when it comes to the wind, unfortunately, our wind speed is actually on the low side. If you were to put in the wind turbines, whatnot, right, in terms of the energy that this can generate will be very limited, right, because of the low wind speed. Hence, comparing the different options, solar is actually the only viable renewable energy option. Although in the recent 1 2 years, there have been a lot of interest in assessing the potential for geothermal, right? And there's also talk about going into nuclear, although I think the nuclear question has not been fully addressed because we are a city state, right? So certainly the public perceptions, the safety related issues will have to be adequately addressed before Singapore take a position, right? So we are very much a constraint in terms of renewable energy options.
I think I'm not 100% sure that regarding this energy innovative approach you mentioned, like which is basically outsourcing the production of low carbon electricity. I think you're the one who mentioned it as a geopolitical dance. Could you elaborate a bit on what are the pro and the con of sourcing your low carbon energy elsewhere than on your own territory?
So the sourcing the renewable the energy or the low carbon electricity from, for example, our neighbors. So that actually requires the cutting of bilateral the agreement. And if let's suppose the electricity is actually to pass through more than one country, then that actually requires multilateral the agreement. Hence, the geopolitical the issues will then come into the picture, right? But I think Singapore has been actually very uh, forward looking, and over the past year or so, in fact, we have actually signed agreement, right, totaling the more than the 4 gigawatt of clean electricity imports, right? But obviously, the devil is in the details, right? For example, what will be the price that will be paying for such clean electricity the imports, right? Because our other neighbors also have their net zero commitments, right? So there are actually a lot of issues, but the one thing is clear. I think once the Singapore government decided on the course of action, right, they will actually put in all the necessary efforts to realize them. So I'm actually hopeful that it will be a win-win arrangement, right? For example, we will collaborate deeply with our ASEAN neighbor so as to sort of increase the deployment of renewable energy projects, right? So that when they have access, they can actually look into exporting some of this clean electricity to Singapore. Yeah, but it may actually require some sort of differential pricing, right? For example, maybe for their domestic demand, the rate will be actually kept at the lower level. But for those that they are exporting to Singapore, that may actually incur certain premium.
What about the infrastructure? I mean, you need connection cable. Are they already there? Do you plan to construct more?
Yeah, so then I think the associated grid infrastructure will be actually the critical, right? When we look at sort of linking up the grid that cut across different countries, right? For one, I think there may be actually the differences in terms of some of the standards, right? So I think this is something that Singapore will have to work with the neighbors, right, to stop finance the grid infrastructure, and that may actually require quite a big amount of upgrade or the expansion of the existing grid. Yeah, so I think this will likely be a costly exercise, but I think this will be actually a win-win arrangement, right? By adopting a collaborative approach, we can actually increase the renewable the generation capacity.
And if I run a data center facility in Singapore, how does it work concretely for me? Is it more, okay, my government is in charge of decarbonizing the electricity, so I consume the electricity that I've got in the grid, that's it, period? Or do they have also to close a deal like purchasing power agreement or the sort of directly with foreign countries?
So this is the part that is still not quite clear because the agreement that has been cut is still the country to country, right? But I think there's actually a lot in interest from the data center operators, right, to have access to as much green electrons as possible. I think what is clear is Singapore government has always actually adopt a very consultative approach. So I'm sure they will be actually reaching out to industry, including data centers, right, to have the dialogue and to sort of come up with a framework, right, such that it will actually benefit for example, data center operators who has the desire to deeply decarbonize their data center operations.
And eventually, because I believe that the Singaporean electricity grid is fully unified, it's a theoretical question, or at least it's a bit like analytics accounting a question, because an electron is an electron. It's not green or not per se,
Yes,
but
yes.
it's more like between the different business interests. Which business interest they can claim between the semiconductor industry, building and heating, and or heating not that much, but cooling, and then the data center industry, which industry will contribute the most to the low carbon electricity sourcing effort. But still, so how many data centers, and how many operators are we talking about? Is it a very concentrated market with a handful of firms running larger facilities, or do you have still a lot of smaller or medium-sized data centers run by, I don't know, institutions, big companies, etc., etc.?
I think it's a mixed bag. So for Singapore, the data center industry, so it has been reported that there are between 70 to 80 data centers, right, operating here in Singapore. So if you look at some of the more recent announcement, in particular Meta, 150 megawatt, right? Obviously, it's huge, right? Then even Sintel, right? After they actually consolidated some of the data centers, so they are actually probably of the range of 70 to 80 megawatt. So again, very sizable, right? And I think there's also the Google, the Microsoft, but certainly there are also the smaller data centers. That's probably the of the range of maybe between 10 to the 20 the megawatt. But I think moving forward for a mature market like Singapore, right, we will have to look at the edge data centers, right, which are smaller in capacity, right? Maybe we should be actually looking at anywhere between 5 to 10 to 20 maximum in terms of capacity. And for those data centers that are handling very high power workload, for example, if you are doing AI training, right? I think it makes more sense to actually have this in, for example, Malaysia, in Indonesia, right? Because they have abundance of renewable energy potential, right? So that they can then obviously have the green electrons to offset the carbon footprint associated with the very high capacity data centers. So I'm actually very hopeful that, right, the various parties, right, various countries can come together, right, to set up what I call the sustainable data network, right, whereby we actually work in a very collaborative fashion so as to more effectively manage the carbon footprint of the entire Southeast Asia region.
Because you're an expert on these topics, whether my electricity is low carbon or not, um, I think the question of reducing the electricity bill is pivotal here. So I would like to ask two questions that are very closely interlinked, as far as I know. How should we build data centers today or refurbish them, and how should we run them to make sure that we save or we reduce as much as possible our energy consumption?
So I think certainly you make an excellent point. I think while there's this constant desire to have access to more green electrons, I think this has to be paired track with energy the efficient technologies, right? I think specifically the addressing the high energy the consumption associated with operating cooling the systems for data centers. Certainly, we can actually look at innovative cooling technologies, right? For example, the exploration or the adoption of a single and two-phase direct-to-chip and immersion cooling systems, right? So these are actually at the forefront of reducing the data center energy use and improving the cooling the efficiency. And there's actually another wonderful side benefit that is the less reported, right? Associated with the use of high efficiency the liquid cooling that actually allows your IT hardware to actually operate optimal efficiency. So meaning that you'll be able to get the optimal workload accomplished, right? Versus, for example, when you are operating your IT equipment under the air cooling mode, right? Which often goes into situation like thermal throttling, right? Meaning that you are not able to fully maximize in terms of the performance. So I think the adoption of innovative cooling technologies is certainly one of the first thing that we want to do, right, in terms of improving the energy efficiency of data center operations.
Just regarding this water cooling approach, I've got a question, which is how sustainable it is. And my question comes with two phases, and we will talk about the water consumption later. The first of all, is it mature enough, or is it still R&D? Because last time I checked, the moment you put metals in water, bad things happen, corrosion and so on. And that will be my very minimalistic contribution to in terms of chemistry. But how much is it like R&D and a bit of hype, or how much sustainable it is? And my second question is, how big the investment, environmentally speaking, but it also comes with a financial cost, obviously, when you refactor or you refurbish your factory to enable water cooling, because you could have like a lot of carbon embodied with the data center facility itself. So hence my two questions, which are two sides of the same coin regarding the sustainability of water cooling technology.
So liquid cooling is not new. It has been actually around for the decades, right? It's just that the data center being a risk, the adverse industry, didn't quite sort of adopt it in a big way. But I think we are actually getting to a stage whereby, because of the increase in thermal design power, because of the sustainability imperative, right? I think we are getting at this stage whereby liquid cooling really needs to be a serious option, and it's certainly well beyond R&D, right? So to give an example, so we actually started my startup company, Coolers DC. We started off with a test bedding at one of the major co-location operators, right, in one of their production data hall. And shortly after the completion of the test bedding, right, so we actually managed to secure a project with a major local bank, and they're actually looking at implementing liquid cooling for 16 racks. And this handling production workload. So certainly, I think it's actually uh, ready for big time. But the challenge is actually, how do you come up with a system that can scale with demand? When you talk about, for example, high power IT equipment, right? It will not happen overnight, right? There will be a scaling up over time. So then the challenge is actually, how do you configure a cooling system, right, that can scale with demand in a very cost-effective fashion, in a fashion that minimize the disruption to ongoing the operations. Yeah. So I think there are actually ways to do it, because without liquid cooling, in fact, there are actually different configuration, right? It can be air-assisted liquid cooling, which can be pronged into an existing brownfield air-cooled data centers, right? Without the laying the elaborate piping network. But then obviously the going back to your second questions, right? Then what about the impact in terms of the environmental impact, right? For example, in terms of embodied carbon, right? So should you, for example, have to set up new data centers? So again, I think it really the depends, right? So with very innovative design, in fact, you can retrofit, right, brownfield data centers to be very energy efficient, and that the major local bank, the client that I mentioned just now, is actually in fact retrofitting one of their existing the data hall, right, so as to support liquid cooling. So that can be done. And the other initiative that I have been spearheading, right, the sustainable tropical data center. That's right. In fact, what we did is actually we retrofitted a 40 plus year old power substation into a very efficient data center test bed. So moving forward, that likely will be the model, right? Because for one, you want to save on embodied carbon, right? And the fact that for a mature market like Singapore, we are actually running short of power, but we are also running short of space, right? We can't keep continuing to have new build data centers, right? But the fact that you see we have a lot of existing building stock, then I think there's one perception that the liquid cooling may actually leads to increased water consumption. Actually, that's not really the case, right? Because in fact, when you talk about direct to chip or emergent cooling, this can be fully the closed system, right? For example, instead of rejecting the heat through a conventional cooling tower, which is obviously going to consume water, you can actually perform the heat rejection using a dry cooler. In fact, we have actually demonstrated this at that cold location data center that I mentioned, right? So we actually demonstrated you can actually simply reject the heat using a dry cooler without consuming the water.
Where do these big headlines about water consumption of main hyperscalers, at least Western ones, come from? if water cooling doesn't consume that much water? Because I mean, all of them, Google, Azure, AWS, they've been blamed to consume a lot of water. So where is the issue here? Because you tell us that, well, it doesn't have, you can run closed system and it doesn't consume water, or at least marginally. So can you enlighten us a bit here?
One option, as I mentioned just now, is actually to use, for example, a dry cooler instead of cooling the tower, thereby having a fully closed system without actually consuming water. But then obviously there's a trade-off, right? So if you operate a dry cooler versus a cooling tower, in terms of the PUE, in terms of efficiency, right? The former, right, well, without consuming water, will be actually less efficient, right? Somewhat less efficient. Then in terms of the footprint, right? So the space required for a dry cooler versus cooling tower is actually going to be bigger. So I think it really has to be a holistic assessment. So what makes sense, right? Do you want to go for example, the best possible PUE, or do you want to have a more balanced so-called matrix, right, involving not only the PUE but also the WUE? So I think that's probably what's necessary moving forward. So for data center operators, including hyperscalers, right, really look at things in a more holistic fashion. But then I think the fact is still hyperscalers actually have very high capacity data centers. So then that obviously will translate to a large carbon footprint. Yeah, so I think that's something actually quite unavoidable in certain sense. But I think as much as possible, we will have to then maybe look into sort of the transition from air cooling to cooling, right? Because that will brings about a reduction in terms of the total energy consumption. So I think that's something that. But I think the other aspect that can be done is actually the end user, right? So we also needs to be probably more prudent in terms of our consumption of digital services, right? So maybe you want to limit how much the TikTok or YouTube that you watch each day.
It's a bit like the elephant in the room. Is sobriety, like digital sobriety, a topic at all in Singapore or in Southeast Asia, as far as you can tell?
Um, I think people obviously the sort of hear in the news in social media that we need to be more sustainable, right? The carbon emission is definitely going to be something challenging to manage. But it's just that I think some of the things doesn't actually trigger down to the individual, to the personal level. So moving forward, we may really need to consider maybe imposing a personal carbon budget, right? So that you're more conscious in terms of, for example, how much digital services that you consume. I think it's all part of being the responsible citizen, right? But I think everyone obviously is conscious of climate change. We really need to take it upon ourselves, right? So that we are also very conscious in terms of managing our consumption. And I think that certainly will be very complementary, right, to all the wonderful energy efficient technologies that we are deploying in our data centers, very complementary to the integration of renewable energy, right? But if let's suppose we can sort of in tandem manage the consumption while actually managing in terms of the energy efficiency improvements, integration renewable energy. I think all in all, that will make the earth more sustainable.
And I'm asking you also the question because in Europe, very recently, energy efficiency directive has been launched, and it was pretty precise regarding the metrics that a data center should now report above a certain capacity. And it goes way beyond just renewable energy and PUE or WE, and it's also waste reuse, etc., etc. Do we have this kind of reporting requirements planned in Singapore, in other areas in Southeast Asia, for instance, or nothing to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge, but at some point we may have to sort of do the same thing. Going back to our earlier discussion that moving forward, like for Singapore especially, we will need to be very selective in terms of the kind of data center, the kind of workload that we are hosting, right? Because obviously we are very much energy constrained. We have very limited options when it comes to renewable energy sources. So I think at some point we will probably need to mandate that the data center operators will actually need to report various matrices, right? For example, be it pertaining PUE, WUE, whatnot, what's the amount of renewable energy, the sources that they're integrating into their operations, things like that. Yeah. But I think it will take a while. I think at least for now, I see the government actually engaging the industry, sort of encouraging them to go through the green transition, right? And I think that's something that will take the some time, right? But I'm sure Singapore government will actually provide the necessary support, right? For example, in terms of grants, in terms of assistance, in terms of the technology, so that the existing stock of brownfield data centers, especially those that are quite dated, right, can then go through this green transition.
Now, I'd like to zoom out a bit and talk about resiliency and the lessons for the rest of the world. Because tropical or humid subtropical climates are pretty widespread around the globe. And for example, in the state of Virginia, home of AWS, and I don't know, PS, if you read it, but in 2022, the reviewer Security Technology published a fictional story about a heat dome descending in the summer of 2025, so it's next year, near the town of Ashburn, Virginia. Ashburn is called Data Center LA by IT folks in the US because it's by far the largest, concentration of data centers, not just in the United States, but in the entire world. And spoiler alert, it ends with a data center manager having to shut down an entire hyperscaler facility, facing the Cornelian choice of either losing billions of dollars in equipment or entering IT history with the first ever cloud blackout. And everything you said in this interview makes this a story some sort of more likely because you describe the worsening climate condition that Singapore faces, all the challenges to cool down data centers, etc. And my question is, how realistic it is, and what are the lessons for pretty much everyone running a data center facility in the world from the specific conditions that operators in subtropical areas, so the one who are the most at risk of heat wave, well, what could be these lessons?
I think certainly the increasing episode of a heat wave is going to pose challenges, right, to the data center industry, especially if they're still sort of using the conventional the air cooling the systems. So I think this is part that kind of dovetail very nicely into why I think liquid cooling is actually the way to go, right? Because one of the studies that we did, which I thought is pretty interesting, right? So what we did is actually we increased the supply air temperature as well as the supply the liquid temperature, right? So because we actually have two racks, one which is actually an air cool rack, the other is actually the liquid cool rack, right? Both having the exact same IT the configuration, right? So only difference is actually the cooling method, right? So what we have shown is actually for the air cool racks, the server's performance, the energy consumption is actually a very strong functions of temperature, right? Because when you're operating your IT equipment using air cooling, all your chip temperature or what we call junction temperature are actually much higher, typically in the range of 80, 90 degrees Celsius. And that's actually very close to the temperature threshold, right? Because you want to protect the electronics. So the server vendors usually actually set the upper temperature limit, right? So once you cross that limit, then the thermal throttling kicks in, right? Because you want to protect your electronics. But when you actually operate your the liquid cool rack, right? Even with increase in supply temperature, what we notice is actually both the performance as well as the energy consumption actually stays relatively insensitive to temperature. So the implication is actually, right, if you have a liquid cooling system, or rather if you're using a liquid cooling system, right, even if, for example, there's actually an increase in your outdoor temperature, ambient temperature, whatnot, right, that's not going to lead to big issue, right, in terms of the performance of your IT equipment, in terms of the energy consumption by the IT equipment. But if you were to actually use the conventional air cooling, right, then you'll get into serious problem, right, because of the increase in your ambient temperature, right? That actually leads to your IP, the hardware, right, going into more frequent thermal throttling, right, which is obviously going to affect the performance, right? That's also going to mean that your IT equipment now is going to have a higher power penalty, right? So I think from the resilience standpoint, right, I think it makes a lot of sense, right, for the industry to actually to look into transitioning from air to liquid cooling. And so that's actually my personal the experience that I can share, right, when it comes to the data center resiliency, right, from the angle of cooling.
However, you mentioned earlier that transitioning a full entire facility from air cooling to water cooling comes at a price, and you were advocating more for a modular approach. So, if how much would it cost for an hyperscaler to migrate entirely air cooling to water cooling?
No, I think it's true, right? If you are sort of looking at retrofitting and air cooled data centers to the liquid cooled data centers, certainly there will be the additional capex, right? The fact that you have a sunk in investment on your air cooling infrastructure, right? Then for you to replace that with liquid cooling infrastructure, certainly there will be additional capex. But it may you may have no choice, right? If let's suppose your tenants come to you and say, "Oh, I'm going to bring in one rack of GPU servers, right? Because I'm going to run generative AI workload, right?" If you don't have the supporting liquid cooling infrastructure, right? There's no way that your tenants, right, can actually operate his high power servers or his high power rack, right? Even if they can operate it, right, they won't be able to get the performance that they paid for, right? So the multiple factors that you need to consider, right? One is actually what is the cost, what is the ROI. The other is actually what is the business opportunity that you don't do it, right? Because if you can't support the high power rack, high power IT equipment, your tenants will take the business and go to your competitors, right? So I think it's really the require a holistic assessment. Right? Certainly ROI is important, right? But at the same time, do you want to future proof your data centers, right? So that you're able to handle the future workload that's going to come into your data centers. So I think operators probably don't really have too many options, right? If you don't do it, right, you are going to fall behind your competitors.
So when economics incentives meets sustainability incentives, that's I think that's a nice way to wrap up the entire episode. Professor, before we leave this episode, I've got one final question: Is would you like to share a positive piece of news with us, whether it comes to sustainability in general or more specifically IT sustainability?
Sure. So I think traditionally the Southeast Asia data center markets are not the known to be trailblazers, right, in terms of adoptions of the most advanced, most innovative solution, right? But because of the confluence of various factors, right, including the increase in thermal design power achieved because of the sustainability imperative. So over the last 12 to 24 months, we have been seeing a lot of interesting development, right? For example, data center markets in Malaysia, in Indonesia are actually starting to sort of call for liquid cooling infrastructure, right? So I think that can propel the region, right? In fact, to be the leaders when it comes to adoption of sustainable and innovative data center solutions. So I'm actually very hopeful, right, that the region can actually show the leadership, right, in terms of embracing the most sustainable and the most innovative solution. But going back to one of our key discussion point, right, it has to be a highly collaborative approach.
Yeah, that was the key word here, collaboration. And we've got a lot to learn from a small but very powerful state who has to work well with all its neighbors and to source electricity and to find innovative solutions. Thanks a lot, PS. That was lovely to have you on the show. I'm eager to see you on stage for Green IO Singapore. I hope that many listeners based in Singapore and maybe some of them based in Southeast Asia will come as well. Thanks a lot again and talk to you very soon.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this Green IO episode. If you enjoyed it, share it and give us 5 stars on Apple or Spotify. We are an independent media relying solely on you to get more listeners. Plus, it will give our little team, Jill, Mabel, Tenny, and I, a nice booster. In our next episode, we will talk about product management and more specifically how to be a climate conscious product manager with Antonia Lendy, a leading voice in the European product ops community, and François Burat, co author of the Climate Product Management Playbook. Stay tuned. Green.io is a podcast and much more. So visit greenio.tech to subscribe to our free monthly newsletter. Read the latest articles on our blog and check the conferences we organize across the globe. The next one is in Singapore, but you already know it, on April 18th, and you can get free ticket using the voucher Green.io VIP, and you already knew it. What you might not know is that early bird tickets for London on September 19th are already for sale. And what you might not already know is that we open the call for speaker for London. So feel free to apply if you've got something interesting to say regarding IT sustainability, whether it's cloud, data operation, design, etc. I'm looking forward to meeting you there to help you, fellow responsible technologists, build a greener digital world.
one bite at a time.